What was going on in the studio, though, was a real tug of war going down to Mexico to shoot Catch 22. But like a lot of movies, it just ran over.
Paul Simon is sitting across from an interviewer, and for once, he is not deflecting. He is 84 years old, and somewhere between surviving significant hearing loss, returning to intimate stages, and sharing a quiet lunch with the man he spent decades avoiding, something in him has settled. The guardedness that defines so many of his public conversations over the years has softened into something more honest, more willing to sit with the complicated truth of what Simon and Garfunkel actually were, and why it could not last. What he is saying now, in his 80s, is what a lot of people suspected for a very long time but never quite heard him say out loud. The story of Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel is one of the most examined relationships in the history of popular music. But most of what gets examined is the surface, the breakups, the reunions, the tension visible even in old photographs where one man seems to be tolerating the other's presence. What rarely gets examined honestly is the deeper architecture of the problem. Why two men who genuinely loved each other as children, who built something remarkable together, could never find a way to sustain it. Paul Simon, at 84, has finally given people enough pieces to understand. They met in 1953, both 11 years old, both living in the Kew Garden Hills neighborhood of Queens, New York. They were cast in a school play together, a production of Alice in Wonderland, and that was where the friendship began. What followed was the kind of closeness that only happens in childhood, the kind built on proximity and shared obsession. In their case, the obsession was music. Specifically, it was the Everly Brothers, the way two voices could lock together into something that felt like one voice and two simultaneously. That sound became their template. By their mid-teens they were performing together, writing together, dreaming together. They were not yet Simon and Garfunkel. They were Tom and Jerry, a duo with borrowed names and enormous ambition. At 15, they recorded a song called Hey Schoolgirl and managed to get it played on radio. It became a minor hit. Paul Simon has talked about the feeling of having a record on the radio at 16, the way it transformed how people saw him in his neighborhood, the rush of it. That early taste of recognition was addictive in the way only early success can be. But even inside that early chapter, before the fame was real and before anyone outside Queens had any reason to care, something in the dynamic between them was already set. Simon was the one writing the songs. Simon was the one driving the creative direction. Garfunkel brought his voice, which was genuinely extraordinary, but the engine of the partnership lived entirely in one person. When that early run of momentum stalled, Simon made a decision that he essentially kept from Garfunkel. He began recording solo material and pursuing other avenues without telling his partner, without explaining himself, without the conversation that the friendship probably deserved. Garfunkel found himself without an act, because the act had always depended on Simon's songs. That quiet episode, easy to overlook when you are focused on the bigger story, planted something in their friendship that never fully went away. It was not a falling out. It was something quieter and in some ways worse, a demonstration of where the real power lived, communicated through absence rather than words. They came back together and eventually released their debut album as Simon and Garfunkel in 1964. It went nowhere initially. Simon left for England, and the record sat on shelves. Then a producer named Tom Wilson made a decision that neither of them had sanctioned. He took their acoustic recording of The Sound of Silence and overdubbed electric instruments onto it, transforming the texture of the song entirely. That version climbed the charts and reached number 1. Suddenly, Simon and Garfunkel were not an obscure folk duo with one forgotten album. They were stars. What followed was 5 years of music that genuinely changed what popular music could sound like and mean. Albums that people still listen to today as complete experiences rather than collections of singles. A reputation that only grew with time. But underneath all of it, the same structural problem continued. Simon wrote everything. Every song on every album came from him. He ran the recording sessions, shaped the arrangements, made the decisions that determined what the music would become. Garfunkel was present, was respected, was consulted, but his role was fundamentally interpretive. He took what Simon created and gave it a voice. And what a voice it was. The problem was never the quality of what Garfunkel contributed. The problem was the fiction that had grown up around it, the idea, projected outward to the public and never quite corrected in private, that this was a partnership of equals. Simon has spoken about this with a directness in recent years that he did not always manage when he was younger and the wounds were fresher. He has described sitting in recording sessions watching Garfunkel offer approval or minor input while he himself had done the work of actually creating the music. He has said that the imbalance of power was real and that it accumulated over time into something he found increasingly difficult to absorb. The frustration was not irrational. A person who writes every word and every melody has a legitimate claim to the creative identity of the work. But the world does not always honor that claim, especially when the voice delivering the work is as distinctive and beloved as Garfunkel's was. The clearest example of this dynamic, and the one that Simon returns to most honestly when he talks about those years, involves the song that defined their legacy more than any other. He wrote Bridge Over Troubled Water quickly, almost unexpectedly, describing it later as one of those rare creative moments where the work seemed to arrive from somewhere he could not explain. He wrote it as a small, modest gospel piece, intimate and contained. Garfunkel and their producer felt it was meant to be something larger, and they pushed Simon to expand it. He wrote a third verse. The song grew into something epic. And then Garfunkel sang it alone, every night, while Simon stood off to the side of the stage. Simon has described what it felt like to watch that happen, to stand in the wings and see the crowd respond with overwhelming emotion to the performance of a song that had come from somewhere deep inside him, and to watch that emotional credit flow entirely toward the voice delivering it. He has been careful to say that the feeling was not Garfunkel's fault. Garfunkel sang it magnificently. But there's a particular kind of pain that belongs to a songwriter watching the world fall in love with his most personal creation while associating it primarily with someone else's name, and Simon carried that pain for a very long time. Garfunkel had his own set of grievances, and they were not trivial either. He understood perfectly well that the royalties went to Simon. The publishing rights went to Simon. The creative authority over their albums went to Simon. He understood that in every way that mattered economically and artistically, he was the junior partner in an enterprise that presented itself publicly as an equal collaboration. Their manager at the time observed that both men genuinely envied what the other had. Simon envied the ease with which audiences loved Garfunkel's presence. Garfunkel knew that Simon held the actual power. Two men looking at each other and seeing what they themselves lacked. The rupture that made everything permanent came when Garfunkel was offered a significant acting role in a major film. He took it. When he told Simon about the plan, that he would go and make the movie and return in roughly 6 months, by which point Simon would have written new material and they would record together, Simon's internal response was immediate and final. He has described thinking, in that moment, that the arrangement Garfunkel was describing was not a partnership at all. It was a service arrangement. Simon would do the creative labor, Garfunkel would come back when it suited him, and the two of them would share billing as though they had contributed equally. He decided then, privately, that he was not going to do that. The film's production ran much longer than planned, stretching the absence for months into something that destabilized everything they were trying to do together. By the time their final album was completed and released, both men were mentally finished. The album became one of the most commercially successful records in popular music history. It won 6 Grammy Awards. And it was essentially the sound of a partnership ending, recorded before either of them had said so out loud. The decades that followed were marked by a bitterness that even people close to them found uncomfortable to witness. Both men built meaningful solo careers. Simon's work during this period included some of the most critically celebrated music of his generation. Garfunkel made records and continued acting. But the shadow of what they had been together never quite let either of them go, and neither did the resentment. There were reunions, a concert in Central Park in 1981 that drew an extraordinary crowd, a world tour, more sporadic collaborations over the years, but behind each of them the relationship remained fractured. People who worked with them during the 1982 tour have said the two men went extended periods without speaking to each other while sharing a stage performing songs about friendship and connection. personal tensions ran alongside the professional ones. Simon once recalled a comment Garfunkel made during a photo session, a remark about height that was delivered with the precision of someone who knew exactly where to put the needle. Simon said that comment stayed with him for 60 years. That detail says something important about the nature of their conflict. It was never purely about music or credit or royalties. It ran through the whole of their shared history, through childhood and ambition and proximity and the particular intimacy of having someone know you before you knew yourself. In 2010, a planned tour had to be cancelled after Garfunkel developed serious vocal problems. Simon, who had committed significant time and energy to the project, felt that Garfunkel had not been fully honest with him about how serious the problem was. That cancellation became the moment from which there was no immediate recovery. Both men went their separate ways and stayed there. What has changed, at 84, is that Simon no longer has the appetite for maintaining that distance. He has said that surviving the near loss of his hearing, a development in recent years that threatened to end his ability to perform and that sent him into a genuine depression before he found a way to come to terms with it, changed his relationship to the things that once seemed worth fighting about. When the instrument through which you hear your own music is threatened, the arguments about who deserved more of the credit begin to sound like the distraction they always were. In late 2024, the two men shared a meal together for the first time in many years. It was quiet, without cameras or publicists or any of the apparatus that had surrounded their previous reconciliations. Garfunkel asked Simon directly what had happened between them, why they had drifted so completely. Simon brought up something Garfunkel had said publicly, years earlier, that had genuinely hurt him. Garfunkel's response was not defensive. He said that hearing it made him cry. That exchange did not undo 50 years of accumulated damage. But it was honest in a way their previous public reconciliations had never quite managed to be. Simon now speaks about Garfunkel's contribution to their work with a generosity that took a long time to arrive. He acknowledges that the voice people heard on those recordings was irreplaceable, not merely technically accomplished but emotionally specific in a way that no other voice could have replicated. He acknowledges that Garfunkel's instinct about Bridge Over Troubled Water, the push to expand it, to give it the scale it ultimately had, was correct, and that the song might have been a much smaller thing without that intervention. He has come to understand that his resentment, real and understandable as it was something he needed to work through on his own terms, not something that said anything true about what Garfunkel had or had not given to the work. At the final concert of his farewell tour in 2018, Simon introduced Bridge Over Troubled Water by saying he was going to reclaim his lost child. He sang it himself. That moment was not a rebuke of Garfunkel. It was something more personal, a man in his late 70s finally doing something he had wanted to do for decades and had talked himself out of, or been talked out of, every time. The reclamation was private and internal even when it happened in front of a crowd. What Paul Simon understands now, and what he was not always able or willing to say, is that the partnership was not something he could have built alone. The words were his. The melodies were his. The architecture of the music came from him. But the emotional life those songs had in the world, the way they entered people and stayed there, was inseparable from the voice that delivered them. Two genuinely different artistic temperaments were forced to coexist inside one partnership, and the friction between them, as uncomfortable as it was to live inside, produced something neither of them could have produced separately. That is not a simple truth. It is not the kind of truth that makes the difficult years feel worthwhile in retrospect, or that undoes what was lost between two men who were friends before they were anything else. But it is the truth. And at 84, Paul Simon is finally saying it.